You don't actually have a phone. I can pop it on there right now. One thing I can think of, Joe.
Yep. Did you have the link for me?
Yeah.
Then I would just call Katie, and if you can put that link up in, oh, I guess we. Hey, Maggie, are you getting this? Oh.
Don't need coffee, just click it.
Just click it, honey. Ah! Okay, you tell me. So, Desi, I can still see your face too. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I can. You took your camera off, but I can still see you on the screen.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Can you tell me how many people are there?
52.
We'll just wait. Come on over. Look at you, good clickers. Come on in. You guys, we broke the internet, folks. Good work. Come on, it's summer in July. We don't need this. Nobody's gonna stay focused long around here because it's about ADHD. Stay tuned, it's coming. Okay, when we hit 100, then.
Okay, you have 110 watching. Go.
Ladies and gentlemen, and people of all ages and sizes, Dr. Jody Carrington here. You have found yourself in the workshop series. Now, what happened is on our event site, usually we just get to do it and it pops on, but it didn't tonight. And then it told us that we can't get into the platform because there's too many people. So we're going to take that as a win. However, what's going to happen tonight is we're recording this, and I'm so impressed with the questions. There's over 100 questions that was sent in before this. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Tonight's workshop is on ADHD, the ups and downs of ADHD. And if you're new here, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I do this workshop series once a month. We pick different topics around mental health just to make the complexities of mental health much more accessible. So just a couple of disclaimers. This is not therapy. And anything that I talk about tonight is certainly my opinion, often backed up by research, but certainly just my opinion. So it's very difficult to talk specifically about cases if we don't have the context. And so this is just some general information that I hope you will find helpful. And you will also have access to a bunch of resources that we've created. Now, all of those landed on the site. You should still have access to those. Des, is that correct? The resources?
Yeah, those will be on our site.
Okay, so there's a bunch of resources on this Google site. You'll see the clickable links there for all of you. So I put a lot of stuff in there that I'm going to talk about tonight, and some books and some podcasts and all those things, because I know our 60 minutes tonight is going to go long. Although we started 15 minutes late, I will absolutely will go the full 90 minutes tonight. And then all of the clickable things that you need are there, so you can follow up after this. There's so many questions and so much to talk about that I know this is going to go fast. So we'll jump right in. Before we do that, two more things. We're going to talk a lot about medication tonight, but I want you to know I'm a clinical psychologist, and all medications are handled by physicians, and which I am not. So I will give you some of the research and some of the conversations around medication, but I just want to be clear that clinical psychologists don't prescribe medications, but we do know a bit about it. So some of us know a bit about it, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And finally, I would just like to acknowledge the land on which I'm coming to you tonight from. This is Treaty 7 territory. I'm in my home office tonight, and this is home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the unceded territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. Every time before I get the privilege to talk on this land that is not ours, I always like to acknowledge that I am just so very grateful to be here. So with that, let's jump in on a few things. Now, of all the workshop series we've had, this is probably one of the most highly attended. And it certainly came with a lot of questions. So I've broken it down to a few things tonight because I want to make sure that I can cover some questions around adult and kid ADHD, and then the neurobiology behind it, and then just what we do about it. So I'm wondering, am I allowed to share my screen here, Des, or is that going to make it a bit tricky? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have some things, because oftentimes what I just want to make clear a little bit about is that attention is a big deal. Okay, so what is interesting to me about this process is that, you know, people often ask this question about why does everybody seem to have ADHD? Why is this a thing now? Is this a thing now? No, because, you know, I'm going to answer all those questions. So here's just a few facts that I'm going to share with you right away, so you can take notes. This is in the notes that I've given you, or if it's easier to just sort of watch along here, I'm going to just jump in to this talk. So take a look here. So this is just where I'm going to just start with a few facts. Okay, so ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosed in children. And, you know, I think a lot of times it's so difficult to get ADHD right without a thorough assessment, because I'll tell you a lot about that. So globally, it's estimated that about 5% of people have ADHD, which is a significantly large chunk of the population. And although it must be present in adulthood, many symptoms persist into adulthood. And sometimes the first time it's diagnosed is adulthood. This is something new, because in the beginning of my career, it was certainly just thought of as a childhood disorder and that kids grow out of it. Not true. So it is a neurodevelopmental condition, which means you're born with it. Okay. And oftentimes people just there's some questions that came in around, can you, because of the way you were treated, just sort of get ADHD. It's a neurodevelopmental condition that can be exacerbated by the environment, but it is part of how your brain operates that's different than what we would call neurotypical functioning brains. And I think, so it's also present both in men and women. It is thought for a very long time, the diagnostic numbers are much more prevalent in boys than they are in girls, or men than women. However, it tends to be a bit trickier to diagnose in females, mostly because the symptoms of hyperactivity are easier to see than the symptoms of inattention. And in girls or women, the symptoms of inattention tend to be much more prominent. Okay, but regardless, now we are thinking that more and more that discrepancy that we thought between boys and girls, or men and women, was so high, it's sort of seeming to be a lot closer than we first anticipated. Okay, so people say, like, is this a new thing? Is it coming out? Listen, ADD was the original diagnostic label, and it really originally showed up in the literature in 1904. So this isn't a new thing that, we were just trying to sort of put kids into a category around. In the 1980s, the diagnosis and criteria was transformed to ADHD formally. So because a lot of people still sort of don't, I think, refer colloquially as AD, colloquially to this disorder as ADD, the formal diagnostic label is now attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it is transformed from the original ADD, attention deficit disorder. And so that is the ADD. The ADD is just an old term. It's not too, it's just an older term. And so ADHD is, tends to be what we use now. And again, this idea of like 1 in 10 have ADHD, and about half will resolve with proper treatment. So the symptoms will resolve with proper treatment. And so this is what's really interesting to me, because it for a long time, even as I was putting this together in my training, there was a lot of conversations around it only happens in kids. You have it, you'll outgrow it. But the perception of this is, the truth of that is that it's absolutely not true. And I'm going to tell you why with respect to the neural development behind it. So the question is, like, it's so interesting to me because attention is a big deal. Like, if you want to get through this world well, you have to have the ability to attend to certain things and block out other stuff. If you don't have a very good ability at attending to certain things, it becomes so easy to miss things. Subtle nuances in communication, very important things like road signs, or how people are responding to you, or what's happening to the specific detail of things, because there's a lot of noise and it's hard for you to sort of narrow that focus. Having the ability to control your focus or your attention can be one of the most important considerations in daily functioning, as you can imagine, right? Your ability to block out some of the noise and stick to a specific fact or a specific conversation, and that is an important skill to hone. And oftentimes when we are kids, we're inundated by so much data because the world is new and we're curious and there's lots of things going on. And so you can imagine then what happens over time is our ability to hone those skills. When your brain has ADHD, it becomes much more difficult to do that a little bit. So attention, focus, concentration are all basically the same thing. So if I use those words tonight, attention, focus, concentration, although there's subtle nuances to all of those things, I'm going to use those interchangeably. And I think sometimes if it just makes it or easier to sort of understand, the idea of attention or being able to focus or concentrate, stay connected to one idea, one person, one topic, one task, one set of directions. I need you to drive to the store, get milk. Can you just stop by the bank and do this and then come back home? The ability to sort of attend to what those directions were and stay focused on that task to be able to complete it, man, that's a big deal, right? And so when there's something going on in your brain that kind of messes with your attention, it's interesting because it has become such a primary focus for so many reasons, particularly in the last decade, for a couple of reasons. I think because two things, we're getting better in the world of, mental health and the idea of sort of being able to identify what this means, as we are with many, many disorders in the world of mental health. But also the world has never been this sexy. I don't know if that's the right term, but there's never been so much to look at. There's never been such important data all the time that allows us to sort of get our attention pulled. So if you suck at this, if you're not awesome at blocking out the riffraff, this idea of having ADHD today means that it is probably a lot more difficult to navigate all of that noise than it might have been if you didn't have so much data to be inundated by. Okay, that's one of the theories. Now, the other way I think about this sometimes is attention is perception. Okay, so what am I perceiving to be happening in the world when I can focus on one thing? And so how we sort of perceive the world is based on what we choose to attend to, not choose to, but what we have the ability to attend to. And so we have information coming into our nervous system all the time. And the things that we attend to primarily is the information that we then believe the world to be, or that we can focus on, or that makes us better or interesting or whatever, okay? So impulse control is about limiting our perceptions. Choosing, focusing, concentrating on the specific things, okay? So if I'm sitting here in this moment speaking to you, there's a lot of opportunities for me to put my attention elsewhere, okay? I can listen to Des typing, I can hear the kids, there's a thunderstorm outside, there's a lot of things that I have the opportunity to attend to. And what I want to choose to attend to and block out, because if I'm getting easily distracted by the fuck is she typing over there? Or what's going on out there? Is there a tornado coming? Because I feel like there's a very large thunderstorm that just went. Do you see? We often have to have the ability to sort of stay focused on the things that we're talking about, because if not, then we easily get distracted in like, what was I saying again? You know? And the truth about attention is it takes a lot of energy, as you can, I might swear too. I should have given that disclaimer. Okay. Just because when I get excited about stuff, this is, anyways, if you're new here, comes with the territory with a psychologist. Okay. So if you have babes listening, maybe, you know, if that's important to you. Okay. Attention it sort of takes a lot of energy. Okay. So you can imagine, right? Being able to identify what I want to do and talk about and stay on topic and stay connected to you, and not now talking about the issue around swearing that I could have taken off on a big long tangent and tell you about why I think it's amazing. The ability to stay focused requires a lot of attention, a lot of resources in your body to be able to stay there, okay? So energy. It's hard work for the brain, because particularly today, there's lots of noise and riffraff. And so this is how I think about it, okay? So ADHD brains are not awesome at the process of picking out the specific things that you should stay connected to. It's not deficient in anything. It's not that you can't focus. It's not that you can't attend to things. It's just that there tends to be a lot of heightened information coming in at many times. So this is so beautiful. So many people have talked about this in this way. Okay, so I want you to think about your brain, maybe even you know, as a conductor, music conductor, or, you know, you're trying to sort of stay connected to one thing. If you can not only be very good at focusing on the music, quieting down the noise over here so that this piece of particular music can be really highlighted, and just know that we're going to get to the next set of things and have that ready to cue over. This orchestration in the ability to sort of function in any day is tricky and hard work. When you pay attention to things like shushing or quieting some of the neural circuits, calling this guy to be higher, shh, 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 you over here, me over here, and now I'm really interested in listening to you, right? That ability to conduct all of that information in your brain is really what ADHD is about. People who tend to be better at that, we would never consider you having attention deficit or hyperactivity happening in your brain, because you just don't. You have the ability to attend much easier. So the background noise, and we can easily suppress it when there is something that demands our attention. But ADHDers often get overwhelmed by that background noise. Okay. How are we doing for questions? Is this making sense to people?
Yes, sorry.
I know.
Yeah, thank you. The acknowledgement's too much in our world. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm watching the chat. Des watching the chat too, and Katie's watching the chat too. So if there's anything that's not making sense, you just pop it in there, okay? And so what I want to be so clear about is that people with ADHD do not have, it's not an inability to focus. The other thing too that I'll just mention that I see on my sheet here that I left for you is there's a strong genetic component. So oftentimes when I'm doing an assessment, I want to, you know, take a look at, you know, does mom, does dad, is there other people in the family? It's an interesting gene because it's really highly connected. And so it often is really interesting to sort of ask about the ability in many people in your family to sort of their experience in this regard. But here's what's so critical about it. It is not an inability to focus, and it has nothing to do with IQ, okay? Oftentimes we tend to think that people who are I don't know, intelligent, highly intelligent, have more likely to have ADHD. It's not true. People with all levels of cognitive ability can get ADHD, and not can get it, but have it. And it isn't the inability to focus. They're distractible and unfocused, but they can also have hyper-focused ability. This is why this is so confusing sometimes, right? Because it's like, listen, people would say this to me all the time at the Children's Hospital, but like my kid can play video games for hours. They can be hyper-focused on anything. And so I don't think you've got the ADHD, or I don't think they've got the ADHD. On the things that you enjoy, you can't determine whether, because when you really enjoy something, it becomes so much easier to quiet the background noise, okay? What I tend to pay attention more to is your ability to stay focused on things that aren't really awesome, that you don't really love. So we often see this, particularly if kids struggle in school. It's hard to stay attentive to math, but oh my gosh, if we're talking about computers, they're amazing, okay? Sometimes that has something to do with the teacher or the friendship group in that moment, but oftentimes this isn't about an inability to focus. It is really about when you need to focus most. Well, how do you manage shush and the noise? Okay. And I think that engaging the attention in the things you don't want to do is a significant challenge. And that in all of our lives involves skill, because many of the things that we need to do well in this world are not sexy. Many of the things that we need to sort of focus on and stay attentive to, like when we're talking to people, or we're learning new things, or we're in school, or we have to get through the monotony of a job, or there's so many other cooler things we could be doing, like going out with our friends or all these other things. I have to stay focused on this, huh? And so that involves the skill. It is almost like a bit of a discipline to be able to sort of notice where you're going to look or pay attention to. And one of the biggest concerns about the ADHD is that so often people self-diagnose or wonder if their children have it. Because here's the interesting thing, it is a skill. The younger, sometimes I want your curiosity to be there. If there's something you really want to do, you're going to tend to be drawn in that direction. And so it becomes really easy to sort of glom onto some of the things we're going to talk about. Oh yeah, they're very hyperactive, or oh yeah, they always lose track of time, or oh yeah. So to be able to sort of diagnose successfully, there's a lot of factors that really help us identify whether this is just, a typical adolescent or a typical somebody going through a hard time, differentiating between trauma experiences too. Quite often, emotional dysregulation, somebody who's experienced significant trauma can also appear like they have many of the symptoms that we're looking for when we're doing the diagnosis of ADHD. So I think that getting a legitimate clinical diagnosis has never been more important. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, because there's a lot of things that I think happen when we're talking about diagnoses that we have to do, be very clear about, because there's a couple of other things that really happen. And I noticed this in some of your questions. Sleep issues also become a problem. And, there's lots of things, as you can imagine, how we sort of stay connected in this place. So let's talk about a diagnosis. There's no blood test. Okay, so this is the hard part. People say, does she have the ADHD? Does she not have the ADHD? How do we know? Here's the issue. This is the issue. I said that 3 times now. Here's the problem in the world of mental health, is that we like it when there's a definitive answer. Do you have depression, borderline personality disorder? Do you have diagnosis, or do you have ADHD? It is so hard to be able to know this because there isn't any clear answer. So the more data you can collect to say, absolutely, this weighs much more heavily in this way, is so critically important. So I'll tell you that if you're working on getting your babe diagnosed right now, if you have ever went through the process, somebody told you have ADHD and you're like, I got ADHD. I would really only trust that diagnosis the more data you have collected to suggest that to be true. because I think this is quite easy to misdiagnose if it's not done correctly. So here's the truth around it. It must be provided. The diagnosis, an official diagnosis, must be provided by a physician or a clinical psychologist, sometimes a clinical social worker. A physician in particular, if you have a pediatrician as a child, a psychiatrist, those are much more highly trained physicians. But I want you to really consider sort of what goes into this. If I were to do an assessment, observation, behavioral checklists, I think I put some examples of that in the document that I gave you, some of the more general ones that many clinicians use during this assessment. The issue with a true diagnosis is it's got to show up in more than one setting. And so often getting teachers or to observe at school, if we talk to your, workplace people, people at home, all of those kind of things, I want to know, is it showing up in different places? The other thing that is so critically important, particularly with kids, but I would also argue for adults, is cognitive and academic assessments. Because what we tend to miss sometimes is learning disabilities that make school look really hard or inattentive, or I could give a rip. Then you come home and homework is hard. But I want to be really clear about what's going on in your cognitive ability. The other thing that really helps me look at is things like working memory. So in a cognitive assessment, a psychoeducational assessment, the strongest predictor of intelligence is your verbal ability. But there's 4 things we measure in a cognitive assessment: verbal ability, how you speak and how you receive language; perceptual reasoning, sort of how you put things together in your head like puzzles; 3rd is working memory; 4th is processing speed. I look at those 4 scores, get them together, and I get your cognitive capacity. If I just had to choose one score alone, I'd choose the verbal ability. But what I'm looking for when I'm really looking for somebody who has got ADHD is what's going on in that working memory. Because you can imagine that my ability to hold things in a short period of time, so not long-term memory, can you think back to when I give you a task, how much can you hold in your head? And most of us can hold 7 numbers, which is why, phone numbers are 7 numbers, give or take a few things. And what happens when people struggle with working memory is they kind of can't remember that sequence, because you can imagine if there's a lot of noise going on, it was like, was it 336, 3234, or 3324? Shit, because I was thinking about, I don't know. Do you understand? So it becomes, working memories are really one of those like sort of indicators that I'm interested in to sort of know whether this proceeds. In adults, I want to talk about that specifically because I get a lot of questions these days about, adult ADHD, and it can be so debilitating. If you truly have a brain that has ADHD, my goodness, the creativity, the curiosity, the brilliance is often there. The ability to sort of think outside the box and not miss a thing, but miss everything at the same time, is so beautiful in people who have this ability. But the issue is, as you can imagine, as an adult, we see increases in traffic accidents, and inability to sometimes stay at a job for a long period of time. And being able to know about it so that you can manage it is sometimes really helpful. So what I think is a little bit different by the time you get to an adult is, again, they'll likely look a bit different than a kid's symptoms. Hyperactivity in a child, maybe getting out of the classroom seat, running around, while an adult may tap a pen over the table, or during a meeting, spin in their chair. Which I think, I don't know, a lot of chair spinning happens in boardrooms, but that's one of the things. Doodle, there's always something very busy that has to happen. And for a formal ADHD diagnosis in adulthood, symptoms should have been present before the age of 12. So that's what we talk about in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. If I were to look specifically, so there needs to be a bit of a historical interview, ideally with somebody who knew you as a child or knew of you as a child, to sort of put those pieces together. Okay. So it kind of requires that person being evaluated, or someone close to them can confirm sort of that part of their history. Now, a thorough evaluation for adult ADHD, I think, should include a detailed and comprehensive interview with the person being evaluated. Again, the ADHD symptoms checklist, and the rating scales, a detailed history, and a spouse, a current relative, close relative can help with that. And then testing to rule out learning disabilities, right? So you are born with learning disabilities, you don't develop those, okay? And here's the interesting thing about learning disabilities. We're going to talk about this probably one time someday, but you have to be smart to get one, because it means that cognitively you're up here, but your ability to learn in certain ways isn't where your cognitive ability is. And I want to know why, which would make many things difficult to do. Okay, so it just allows, again, for more of that data to sort of figure out for me or for us, does this really fit into this category of ADHD, or is there something else that we're missing? And testing to rule out, yeah. So, and with kids too, a couple of things I would consider is hearing tests and vision tests, okay? Because what happens when we get into the diagnosis, there are 3 subtypes. All right. So we talked again about, boys versus girls, men versus women, those who identify boys and girls. How do we sort of differentiate? Again, much more easier. I think the hyperactivity is often easier to see than the inattentive subtypes. And so there's 3 subtypes: hyperactivity, inattentive, and then combined type. So you have both of those things. So those are the 3 subtypes. So I'm looking specifically when I look at a kid who has got the diagnosis, I want to know specifically when the clinician was looking at their symptom profile, where do they figure they fit? And why that's important is it really often sometimes dictates treatment. What am I going to do in the classroom? What am I going to do in your home life to be able to help you manage symptoms a little bit more? Okay. So when I want to think about diagnostic criteria, I'm going to just pop out of here for a second so I can see your beautiful faces. Actually, I can't, but I'm going to just pop out for a second. Diagnostic criteria, I think also, I just want to be clear if you're considering this or, really thinking about where you're at with this. For children and teens up to 17, the criteria call for having 6 symptoms. And so for teens 17 and older, and for adults, having 5 specific symptoms, or at least 6 for at least 6 months, that interfere with play, social life, school, and or work. Okay, so this is true of any clinical diagnosis. We all have varying degrees of anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, attention issues, all of those kind of things. When it becomes a clinical diagnosis, it's typically the rule that I think about all the time is how much is it impacting functioning. That's when it sort of steps into that clinical range for me. And I think that, several symptoms should have been appeared before age 12. We've talked about that in adulthood. But oftentimes the suggestion is, be very careful to diagnose before age 7, because there's a lot of stuff going on in that prefrontal cortex prior to age 7. And sometimes it's just so apparent. I've seen that, happen much sooner in the ADHD clinic, or certainly in the the inpatient psychiatric unit. Sometimes you can take a look at that, but a little bit sooner. But that's often sort of one of the things, like, let's just be careful, because kids should be inattentive and busy and all of those things. And so let's not pathologize too much. So it's got to be present in more than one situation. So such as at home and at school or at work. And it's not the result of a different mental health disorder. So I want to rule out other things that could be getting in the way, things like trauma. And one of the things that somebody asked about in the questions, that I thought were just brilliant is, can we talk a little bit about ADHD and trauma and the differentiation between them? Can you have ADHD and trauma? Yes. Can trauma, when we talk about the brain being able to just not sort of block out some of the noise, being inundated by a lot of things in an ADHD brain, you could imagine in a hypervigilant brain that's been experienced a lot of trauma. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is flipped up, and there's a lot of trauma in there that sort of tends us with trauma to have our shoulders up a lot. You will look jumpy. You may look like it's hard to focus and concentrate because there's a lot of shit going on in your brain. The symptoms sometimes can look quite similar, but I want to know the story. That's part of the diagnostic interview. That's part of how did we get to this place? Tell me about your story, which then really helps me differentiate between whether this is a hyper-aroused brain because of what has happened in your life, or whether there is a legitimate case of, dopamine, a lack of dopamine in your brain, which is really sort of the neurobiology behind ADHD. And so I think let's talk specifically a little bit about inattentive and hyperactive behaviors. And so inattention, again, this is much more common in girls, the inattentive subtype, but inattentive behaviors are things like missing details. There's so much going on in your head that you just sort of like miss the little details. Okay. Sustaining attentions like to play is hard because you get easily distracted. Oh, there's something beautiful over there. It's like, what was I doing here again? It doesn't seem to listen. Sometimes kids don't seem to listen when they're spoken directly to, because they're attending to a few other things. And depending on cognitive ability, sometimes they can manage all of that quite effectively. But other times it's just a little bit more awesome what's going on in their head, or what they're hearing over here, what they're thinking about they're going to do over there, than the directions that you're giving them. Okay. And sometimes following through on instructions is a thing we see quite often. And you can imagine there's a lot of background noise and a lot of stuff happening in that head. You just said, put your snow pants on, get your coat on, get your lunch in your bag, and get out to the car. So what I heard was get out to the car. Okay. So I'm in the car with no coat, no snow pants, got my boots on maybe, but I missed those steps in the middle because there's a lot of stuff going on in my head. And difficulty organizing things. Again, really interesting. There's a lot of conversation. Huberman has done a really nice job of talking about the piling system that often happens with people with ADHD. So there's a vast majority of piles. I mean, and just because you pile things in your office doesn't mean you have ADHD. But it's like there's the sense of I can figure this out. It's an organized chaos in my own head because I put these things here in a moment of organizing. But people with ADHD tend to have a much more difficult time organizing things, which makes sense to me because there's a lot of background noise. Avoids activities that will take a lot of focus, like puzzles, number games. And the other thing that we tend to see sometimes is losing things, right? So one of the questions I ask, parents sometimes is, how often do they lose track of time? Do they lose items? Have they ever been able to go through a school year and keep the same set of mitts, or at least, 2 or 3 sets of mitts? Oh my God, they lose them all the time. And you don't know what this is. Now, just because your child loses things doesn't mean they got the ADHD. Okay. Because oftentimes there's a lot of things going on in the world, but it's just one of those things again, that I would be like, that's really interesting for this kid. Running late. Now, lots of people run late, but you can imagine, right? Again, inundated by some data, it's hard to sort of stay on track or keep organized. Procrastination. And I think that it's interesting because, again, it's not an inability to do this. So as we sort of dip into some of the treatment ideas, you'll see very quickly that what we're talking about is you tend to do much better when time limits are provided and if consequences are clearly laid out, which means if I don't get this done, I know I'm going to struggle with this. If I don't know this to be true, then I know I'm really going to have to get it. So oftentimes people can buckle down when they know the assignment's due, the test is due. If I'm in trouble here, I need to be able to sort of come through on this. Okay, so it's not that it isn't. There isn't an ability to focus. Again, it's like the parameters we put in place that make it a bit easier to shut down the noise. Okay, cool. How are we doing? Any questions? Everybody's good? Okay.
Son was diagnosed at 4, should be taking medication.
Okay, good. I'll jump into that in a minute. Now, so the hyperactive stuff is probably much more easily understood. Okay. And often what we think about, super ADHD kids is the fidgeting, the tapping, the squirming, leaving their seat, trouble staying seated, on the go. Oftentimes one of the questions in an interview is like, does your child appear to be driven by a motor? I always thought that was a funny question, but it's often on many of the checklists. Talking excessively, blurting out answers, if there's so many things you want to say or you want to get done, and there's not the ability to sort of focus very clearly on somebody's subtle behaviors, you're going to miss it. Now, most kids miss the social cues, right? I mean, our daughter's 10 and busted into a conversation today, right? I was like, whoa, just a second. Right? We were talking, right? So there's oftentimes, remember that prefrontal cortex isn't very big anyway. But the idea of blurting out answers and interrupting when it becomes excessive and so noticeable to other people, or they have a hard time just taking their turn, right? That's just one other clue in this big assessment process that, like, okay, something else, might be going on. Again, I think that, when we think about interrupting, intruding, those seem like such rude behaviors, and we often try to sort of get after kids around things like this. But I want you to think about, truly, a brain with ADHD is that there's just a lot of stuff going on there, and I just need to get it out. Okay. So again, we talked about the subtypes around inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, or impulsive symptoms, and then the combined type, which is, those two put together. Boys tend to be much more common in the inattentive or the combined type realm, and girls tend to be much more common in the world of the, sorry, what did I just say? Boys are much more common in the hyperactive realm. Is that what I said out loud? I didn't say that. Okay. So hyperactive often is what we see in boys, much more often than we see in girls, the inattentive subtype. But it doesn't mean you can't have both either, or we can mix all those things up. And I think the better we get at sort of truly unpacking the specifics, it becomes, we're getting better at it. Okay, so the neurobiology, I just want to put this up for you real quick, because I just wanted to give you a, around the neurobiology behind it, because I think I found this really quite interesting when I was trying to really understand what's going on in the brain of somebody with ADHD. And okay. Here's the critical piece. Okay, so dopamine is a neuromodulator and the biggest player in ADHD. So when we think about, there's many neurotransmitters up here going on in the brain that transfer messages down our neural pathways. Okay, so I mean, I do not claim to be a neuro expert in any stretch of the imagination. Okay, but let's just very rudimentarily say that there are neural pathways and there is neuromodulators that facilitate the messages that are transferred throughout our whole body, okay, particularly up in our brain. And it's a big player. It helps us, dopamine in particular, and a little bit of epinephrine, but mostly dopamine in particular, is the critical thing in helping us with hyper focus and motivation. Interesting thing about the ADHD, we lack the focus and our motivation sort of starts to go away because we're not really motivated to look at that thing that we need to look at, right? So I'm listening to all the background noise and there's not enough of a consequence or something really sexy for me to be able to sort of attend to things. Dopamine has a big deal. Are you excited about something? Okay. We fixed the internet, but we're going to stay here now because I think we got too many people over here. Okay, it'll be on both. Good. Des Vino, ladies and gentlemen, has just saved the day. So dopamine is a neuromodulator and the biggest player in ADHD, okay? More dopamine narrows that attention, okay? So just in the very, I mean, gosh, this is far more complex than my brain can even, not even, but then can handle, but just very simply, dopamine narrows attention. Now, the brain, as we sort of talked about, like a seesaw or a symphony, is sort of trying to navigate what it's going to perceive, the noise over here, what it needs to do. So, I mean, when we think about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic parts of our brain, but again, not necessarily, I think dopamine acts as the conductor to those things, right? Where am I going to put my intention? What am I going to shush? What am I going to hyper focus on? So ADHD sort of messes with that conductor. And multitasking often takes place in the prefrontal cortex. So, a lot of times we've talked about this. Most of this stuff is happening in the prefrontal cortex. And it's just having trouble trying to decide who should be shushing and where it should be focused on. That's it. That's ADHD. And dopamine is a big player in that. So, I mean, there's lots of research papers around this, and I put some of the links in here if you want to read further. I think the Spencer work in 2015, the dopamine hypothesis has always been that dopamine levels are too low. It leads to unnecessary firing of neurotransmitters. Okay, so everything looks quite attractive. And one, if you think about it like a symphony, like one member of the band is playing when another one shouldn't be, and then this guy starts to take off on a drum solo, and this guy back here misses his cue, and there's a lot of things happening, and you can't really be able to say like, okay, stop. I need this and I need that. So the conductor's sort of like, what the shit's going on here? Okay, because they don't got a lot of dopamine there to help them. So the low dopamine hypothesis is so fascinating because one of the things that increases dopamines is stimulants, which is interesting. They're very attracted to those with ADHD. You know what has stimulants in as a part of it? Things like caffeine, cigarettes, cocaine. I know, wide range of things there, jumping from the caffeine to the cocaine. However, there's the basis is all increased levels of dopamine, particularly in the areas of the brain that modulate attention. Fascinating. Hey, I love this stuff. So for kids, they tend to indulge in highly sugary foods. There has been a lot of conversation around, does the sugary foods cause these kids to have the ADHD? We are attracted to things that make us feel more connected, more focused. And oftentimes it is the thing like, we've abused caffeine. We've used caffeine for many, many, many years. We need that cup of coffee in the morning to get us started and focused. And, if you are a fairly neurotypical person, a little extra hit of caffeine allows you to stay focused. Yeah. And this is not untrue about things like sugary food, the cocaine. I know it's a big stretch, but just stick with me. And so it's not necessarily because they're too impulsive when we start to think about the sugar hypothesis. Stimulants heighten the level of focus in people's brains where they don't have a lot of dopamine, okay? Sugar in kids without ADHD tends to make them hyperactive. That's the dopamine because they already had enough and they added more, too much. Losing their minds. Make sense? I love it when I say, I ask you a question and I expect an answer. So I'm just this is what you're doing right now. Okay. So that leads us into, that's a very, very quick neurobiology sort of run through. And I'm going to put lots of resources here that will allow you to sort of jump into that a little bit more. Okay. And here's what I think about when we think about treatment. Okay. Issues around any mental health condition that is difficult to measure often makes us a bit worried to treat this with medication because we're worried about this. This is true in anxiety, depression, any other thing in my world. But let's talk a little bit about treatment real quick, okay? One of the things that has been found, in fact, the thing that has been found to be the most as helpful in people with ADHD is to, of course, increase the dopamine. And that is done most effectively via stimulants. Like speed, meth, it is a stimulant. So this is getting very concerning as we start to talk about putting that kind of drug in the body of a child, right? Now, the reason stimulants work, so this does make sense. If we have a really hyperactive kid, why are we giving them stimulants to be able to do this more? Again, what we've noticed is what people with ADHD are missing is dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter that allows us to focus a little bit more. And it is very common, very much a part of stimulants. So the reason stimulants work and don't send hyperactive kids over the edge is it allows the network to be active and then allows them to learn what focus is. So here's what's interesting is it doesn't create a better ability to learn. It doesn't create, it doesn't make you smarter. The whole point is it quiets the noise so you can start to develop skills around being able to focus. okay? Sometimes people are just not that good, even if you use all the strategies. So there is a range of severity of ADHD. You know, I sometimes when I can think about kids that I've assessed and treated that with clinical ADHD that I was like, not a question in my mind. And then other kids that took a while to sort of work through all of those pieces, okay? And so the more severe that the symptomology tends to be, the more disruptive it tends to be in life. Sometimes when there's not a lot of cognitive resources in there to be able to sort of modulate all of the information, it becomes much more difficult. When we introduce trauma as well, some of those things, as you can imagine, makes it easier to sort of, or more difficult, I'm sorry, to be able to navigate all that noise. And so what I think is really interesting sometimes is that, particularly with kids, when we think about treating, I want to think about the things that I can do to quiet the noise to make your life more effective. Okay. This is very true in adults too. What are the things I can be doing that quiets the noise that's going to allow you to focus and attend to the things that you want to, whether you're going to be effective at work, whether you're going to, get through the studying period, whatever that looks like. Okay. That should be the focus of ADHD treatment. I want to get better. I want you to get better at developing the skill of focusing. Okay. And sometimes that takes, I'm going to go through some of the things you can do with or without medication. Doesn't matter to me, right? The severity with which you are, it will be much more difficult for a kid and adult to be able to learn those skills because the noise is just too fucking loud. Okay. It's like, I often think about this from a medical perspective. If you had diabetes, a severe form of diabetes, no matter how much you modulated your diet or did well, your insulin's going to spike. Okay. It doesn't matter how good you are. You have such an overload or an unmodulated system around that insulin in your body. Doesn't matter how good you are. You just can't physically on your own do this. This is true for some kids with ADHD. It is a neurological condition. And sometimes parents get so frustrated, teachers, caregivers, coaches get so frustrated because they can't learn or they can't organize or stop talking and what I struggle with sometimes is sort of differentiating, is this kid being a kid? Is this kid being a manipulative, attention-seeking liar? Which I've seen few of those. There's always a reason behind behavior. I want to figure out why. Okay. And what I can do to assist in making this much more manageable, given all the stuff that's going on in your brain. Okay. So let's talk about medication just for a second. Again, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't prescribe medication, but I do know a lot about it because many of the people that I try to assist as a psychologist, it sometimes is necessary to have medication on board so that we can do the treatment that will help you learn how to focus. I want to give you the skills, particularly as a kid, so that you have that to your repertoire, okay? So that you are better able to fight the noise, yeah? If I can't get past the noise to teach you those skills, you never have them. Got it? And so some of the indications, particularly in the early literature, is like the earlier you can diagnose, successfully, right? Not just slap on a diagnosis, but go through all the things that we talked about and then get the diagnosis is going to make it easier for me to start to teach you those skills. Okay. Now, when we talk about medication specifically, treating the dopamine should lead to better levels of focus. Okay. That was always the theory. So much of the research has been around typical, what drugs might be able to assist in that process. So things like Ritalin, Adderall, Adderall's amphetamine and dexamphetamine. And so the specifics around that, their job is to increase levels of dopamine and to focus a little bit on norepinephrine, but we'll just focus on the dopamine piece right now, even a little bit of serotonin. But again, the biggest focus is the dopamine piece. And it can be effective, especially when they're provided early on, because it allows the skills to develop. Okay. I can get better at, okay, how do I have to stay focused in class? What really helps me to do these things? What are my skill levels in that? So, but I think what's so critical is not to zoo a kid with medication and the things that I think are really tricky around this, which is why I really, having a good healthcare professional, a physician who really understands this, a psychiatrist, psychologist, somebody who understands this process, dosages vary in severity, age, and metabolism. So they often require frequent monitoring, right? To be able to, because you don't want to have so much medication on board that you're over focused and, you know, really connected to so many things in the evenings. You can't slow down. Nobody can sleep. It's a big deal. I mean, sleep is often difficult in people who have ADHD, treated or not. And so we just want to sometimes be very clear about, you know, I often hear parents struggling with, oh, the meds wear off. We could tell right away by the time he got to hockey practice, or, you know, we couldn't get him out the door, and then we did, and then he couldn't sleep. And, you know, what are all these things? And so it can sometimes be really tricky. I can also tell you that I have seen people, kids and adults, get their life back when they work closely with the physician and modulate the areas, the levels of dopamine effectively. I've kind of seen the whole gamut. When kids are often misdiagnosed with ADHD, particularly if there's a trauma history, I saw this a lot in child and family services. He's got the ADHD, he can't focus, he can't listen, he's not attending, obviously he's ADHD. You would treat with stimulant medication and it wouldn't work, okay? Now, just because you're resistant to medication does not mean you don't necessarily have it, but it's one of those clues again for me that I'm like, are we missing something? And then what would happen is sometimes is that because the stimulant medication wouldn't work with a kid with a massive trauma history, we would up that dosage again and again and again, and then add something else like an antipsychotic that would just flatten them. And that always crushed my soul, you see, because we're not treating the right thing. Behavioral symptoms that tend to look like ADHD might be something much different, like a hyperaroused body system that I need to treat to be able to allow the focus to return, okay? So I think I'll just speak briefly about some of the more common ones. Adderall. So Adderall increases norepinephrine and dopamine. Motivators like to increase motivation and alertness. Adderall is a very highly, I don't know if abused is the word, misused drug by college students. In fact, I think I've seen data that would estimate, 60 to 70% of all college students have accessed Adderall in some points on the black market because of the ability to allow an increase in focus. Some of the things that you'll notice in people on stimulant medication where either they've overindulged or they don't require it, specifically is a dilation of the pupils. I mean, often we see this in people who have had taken cocaine. There's a whole theory around the pupil dilation piece, which I think you probably may not be as interested in that as I am, but I'm just fascinated by the fact that, we want to just really even, move our symptoms to, or our bodies to a place of harm in order to sort of get that one piece, instead of working much more readily on sort of how do we develop the symptoms of or the skills of focusing. Okay. Vyvanse is another really common one. Ritalin, and also known as Concerta. So Vyvanse is probably the newest, one of the newer ones where they talk a lot about, being able to take a piece of Adderall and sort of, it was sort of developed to get around the substance abuse of Adderall, but there's an interesting piece about Vyvanse that I think is really interesting. It's kind of like a time-release dexedrine. Dexedrine is a much older one as well. Ritalin, and now sometimes Concerta. Adderall and Vyvanse are more popular now than Ritalin because we've really tended to, the drug companies have been much more specific on, what part of the brain they can treat. So I think it's, again, being able to find what works best with your metabolism, your child's metabolism, all these kind of things is all questions for your physician. But I just really wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that, there is the potential for abuse, and there is, sexual performance inhibitors that sometimes happen. Always the concerns around cardiac effects, like all those questions that I want you to really have for your physician becomes really important. And the dosage matters. How it reacts with, the body, whatever body you're in, is important because it can be freedom for so many people. If operated with correctly. But again, as parents, you know, making a decision about this, the severity, the ability to function day to day, all of those things are things that, you know, come into our things to consider, because increases in dopamine quite simply quiets the noise. And it's such a critical part of attention. So, you know, focusing to sit still or pay attention to how full we are. I had a really good question about binge eating and ADHD. Our introception means how we internally respond or focus in on our bodies. And we tend to lose the ability to be introceptively connected. So you're like, oh my God, I'm a binge eater, I have ADHD. This is just another thing that I want you to pay attention to when we think about this, because you know the impulse that you're not sort of focusing on the specific messages of your body. So one of the questions often too that we get, or that I've heard many times, is, you know, why wouldn't you wait until puberty to sort of give medication, or why wouldn't you wait until later, until the here's the interesting thing. It's all about skill development for me. The earlier we can get the brain in a place to manage that skill of focusing, if I can give you the best shot at learning that skill of focusing, right? That's the thing I really want you to weigh out, because it's so much harder to treat an adult brain than it is to treat a developing brain. Okay. It doesn't mean drugs won't be effective when you're older, all of those kind of things. It doesn't mean you can't learn the skills when you get older, but it's like the sooner we can sort of make sense of this and figure out exactly what's going on, tends to mean that we can help a little bit better. Neuroplasticity, as we know, is highest when babes are young. So you can kind of reshape the brain at an accelerated rate. You know, the data would just be very clear on this. Early treatment is the key. Okay, so let's look at some of the focusing facts. How are we doing?
You've been over questions.
Okay, so we're going to go into questions right now, but I want to make sure I gave you some skills. The other thing that I think I'm just going to mention quite quickly before we get into here is people often ask, has smartphones messed this up? I'm going to just stop this for a second and tell you this. You know, is the inundation of data, like now that we sort of get all these things, is this exacerbating? Is this creating ADHD? Okay, it's not creating ADHD. Okay, because if you got low dopamine in your brain, being inundated on screen time all the time does not shoot less dopamine in your brain. Okay, but you can imagine if you do have ADHD, we have now never had so much access to so much noise. Okay, so I think part of the reason we're also getting more clinically astute, we've never had this much input of data. And so the ability to really wade through some of these behavioral presentations really matters a lot, keeping things in context about this. So has the smartphone messed it up in adolescence? Yes. Some of the data is like less than 60 minutes per day is needed if you don't want to mess up your attention on devices. Less than 60 minutes a day. We spend, anyway, that's another topic that we're going to talk about, I think, in the fall. And I think it's so interesting. The brain does not do well with constant context switching. It's exhausting. Email, and you think about this, I mean, sometimes I have this, like I have this screen on, I'm working on this, I got music in my ears, I'm trying to understand all these things. Yeah. The brain doesn't, that's an exhausting workout for the brain, particularly if you don't have a lot of dopamine, it even makes it worse. Okay. So sleep is so critically important in this world of ADHD, as you can imagine. But I think here's the question. How do we get better at this? Okay. Because you quit talking because there's too much. How come? Just a minute. I'm going to try to switch back over now so you can see it. Speaking of ADHD, all right, it is right here. Okay, so here is some of the things that will help around focusing with ADHD, with medication on board or not. Really cool study by Goldman that I wanted to put up there first around attentional blinks. So I want you to think about it. It's such a cool concept. Andrew Huberman talks about this a lot too, which I really think is interesting. Think about the Where's Waldo task. Okay. When you find Waldo, you pause and celebrate in your brain. Okay. just a little bit, like, oh, I got it. And you cut out everything else. So during that pause, you block out other Waldos, other information that's coming. Your attention blinks. I love this concept. So people with ADHD tend to have many more attentional blinks because they are celebrating on a particular thing that they got or they found or something happened, in part because you're over focusing on certain things. You're not failing to focus, maybe just over focusing on certain elements. And so the answer is sort of open monitoring. So practicing a little bit more instead of like soda, I think they call it like soda straw, like looking through a soda straw and just sort of like panoramicing everything. So settling in a little bit to notice many more things. And if you don't sort of get where I'm going with this idea of meditation, the idea of slowing down and taking in data, helping your brain slow down to avoid attentional blinks is a skill. And when I was reading about this study, I was like, damn it, because you know how much I really want to start to meditate. Like I want to very badly. I know how good it is for me. I know, but I sit there, honest to Christ, this is what happens. I sit there like this. And I'm like, oh, fuck, I forgot about this. And I got to do that. And I got to do this. And I got to do that. And holy shit, I got to think about something else. Like I think it's the dumbest thing in the world, meditating. You being able to train your brain to be able to, so practice for 15 minutes, practice for 3 minutes. Okay. The idea of slowing down, just practice taking in all the information, breathing, noticing significantly reduces the amount of attentional blinks. And this is very true when we age. It's like rewiring our brain to drop its shoulders. Okay. If you've listened to me for very long, it's this constant necessary requirement for us to remind our bodies to drop your shoulders. It's a little trick I often tell people that just wherever you are on the run of the day, think about where your shoulders are. And I promise you they'll be up here, but you got to do it on purpose. When attention becomes something you want to get better at, practicing it matters. There's a sense of giving your brain a bit of a break so it can be better at not blinking. Okay, so that's attentional blinks. Number 2 is fidget opportunities. The question is, do they work? I mean, sometimes I hear teachers say, I walk in a classroom, everybody got that move and sit kitchen, and they got the fidget toys and they're zinging this thing and puttying this thing and popping this shit. Do they work? And I'll tell you what. Moving some of the physical energy does enhance your ability to focus energy or to focus mentally. So if I've got a lot of stuff going on in my body, if I can just fidget, I then can move some of that physical energy out and put my focus somewhere else. Okay. So the data is really interesting about this. This also helps with adults. Okay. And so you often, I don't know if you've ever seen, any movies like a lot of the stock trader movies, they'll have the fidget toys or there's something that are happening, so they can click a pen and it just sort of gets that physical energy out and allows them to stay focused. I think it's so true. Tap your foot, move your knee. You can shuffle your focus and keeps. So here's the interesting thing. I was listening to this. I think this is Huberman again. No. Somebody was talking about this as a physician. Sometimes if you start to lose your focus, like in a surgery, if you are really, starting to sort of zone out of things, tapping your foot or to a certain beat, when you, move your knee, it can shuffle the focus away a little bit and your hands will steady. Other parts of your body will be able to sort of stay focused a little bit. If you hold your hand in one situation for a really long period of time, and it starts to get shaky, right? If you can balance that by tapping a foot or moving other little parts of your body that then allow you to sort of focus down on that. It's so fascinating where you put your attention that allows certain things to sort of slow down. So that idea of fidget opportunities, there's a massive amount of data on it, but it does work when we do it very deliberately. Okay. Not just like everybody gets a fucking pop it and they're like losing their minds. Okay. But I want you to know why you're doing it and how you're doing it and if it's being used effectively. Minimize distraction. Shocker. That's number 3. How do I create a work environment or a study environment? Well, I would decrease the amount of distractions. We have to talk about noise canceling headphones. There is a massive amount of data on just white noise. Being able to block out some things that allow us to kind of just pressure down a bit when you really need to focus and get things done. Okay, if you do that for yourself, you're giving yourself the best bet. You're giving your child the best bet. Okay. List making is crucial. Okay, I don't care who you are. The older you get, list making is crucial, whether you got the ADHD or not. Okay, because even in general cognitive decline, when we think about patients with dementia or people sort of who lose their ability to stay focused as we age, list making is crucial because it allows us to stay on task, even if we wander, even if we have 57 things to do today. And I'm going to get like, oh, I'm just going to check the internet. You know, there's a reason around people have rabbit holes, because you get lost down something. I'm just going to check the internet on that. I'm going to take a break on the Instagram. And 2 hours later, you've like learned how to drink collagen off the back of a table. I don't know where I was going to go with that. There was an intentional blink there. But what happens in this process is our ability to sort of make sure we stay on task is how are we putting resources in place that allow us to sort of come back home, come back to ground zero, come back to that place of what do I need to do today? And so what we're doing then is training ourselves to get back to this place so that I can stay task oriented. Okay, if we do that for kids, sometimes being able to put lists on the mirror, checklists on things. Here's the 4 things I want you to do every morning before you leave the house. So put it by the door. Did you do those 4 things? Right on, buddy. Have a great day. Right? As an adult, if I'm going to go to work and I'm going to do my very best, I'm going to do a couple of things that I know is going to help me have a lot of access to my focus. Exercise and sleep are particularly necessary. Great question about a police officer with ADHD. How do we stay attentive? I was looking at some research around this because I was like, that's really fascinating when you really have to focus on things. Doesn't mean you can't focus. It's what do we do to give ourselves the best bet to stay there? And the more you know about the way that you process information, the easier it is to be able to do that. Routines are grounding. And here's the interesting thing about routines. When I know what to expect, it takes much less of my resources trying to understand, okay, am I supposed to get groceries today? What is happening? What are we doing here? How come this card did well? But when I know a little bit more clearly that this happens then, this next, it opens up my ability to stay connected. Okay. And again, the other thing, the last thing I'll leave you with is breaking down massive tasks so we can get very overwhelmed with things. If you want your kids to do a number of things, like do this, one at a time. Take this to your room, come on back to me. Okay. Now I want you to get your plate out of the cupboard. Good. Now we're gonna load up for supper. Okay, let's go. And it's not about they can't focus. It's about how the information is presented to allow them to be more successful. And when you get more successful at it, you're much more in a place that you want to learn, you want to stay connected, you're motivated to do well in that particular setting or with that particular relationship, okay? So know also if you're a coach, if you are a teacher, if you're somebody sort of assisting people who have attentional difficulties, the relationship matters. Because I will want to do better. I am more motivated to do well, skate harder, be more productive under a boss, a coach, an educator who I know got me, okay? So the good news is, oh, just wait, we're gonna talk about anxiety in August. The good news is, there's so many successful people with ADHD. Okay, this isn't, it is a concerning issue. It is a neurodevelopmental issue. It can be so debilitating for kids and adults if we don't do our very best to assist in the process. But it is known that people with ADHD have specific strengths as a result of their brain functioning a little bit differently, more spontaneous, creative, energetic, intuitive, imaginative, inventive. Here's some people who have ADHD: Adam Levine, Howie Mandel, Michael Phelps, Justin Timberlake, Simone Biles, Jim Carrey, Emma Watson, Will Smith, Ryan Gosling, okay? To name a few. Those are beautiful souls who do amazing, wonderful things in this world. And so this doesn't mean that it's the end of the line for sure. There's so many wonderful things that are happening in there. So I've put a number of interesting things in there that, you know, you can take a look at in the resources list. And now I want to just jump into a few questions because I know we're running a little bit out of time. So Des, I know you have some questions there. I have some beautiful ones that you sent in. I'm going to try to go through as many as I can. Did you write some down for me?
Yeah, the biggest one was the effective marijuana. That's 4 different types.
The effect of marijuana on ADHD. I don't know. That is such a great question. Here's what I know. So there's a couple of things that people have asked. Concussions, hormone changes. Here's the thing. In any change in your body and your brain, it will affect the way that you process information. Okay. And oftentimes, marijuana isn't a stimulant per se. There's this idea of being able to slow the process down, but it is not allowing you to sort of focus any better. Okay. So I'm not sure about the data around this. So I'm going to plead the fifth on that. But I think there's got to be a lot of information around, you know, the desire to be slowed down and the effectiveness then to be able to then function more or better is something that's interesting. I know there's a high propensity, a much higher propensity to use drugs to have, you know, when you're feeling completely out of control or unfocused. Okay, so I think there is a high correlation between people with particularly more severe ADHD and, you know, wanting to be connected to something that would then slow them down. The question is around your ability to function that I think really matters. And so it's the difference between feeling good and the impairment of functioning that I think we often have to question. So I hope that helps a little bit. I loved some of the questions. Is it okay to remind your ADHD university student who lives away from home that they need to do things? Yes. I want you to think about, you know, sort of putting things in place for kids when they're younger. And if we miss those moments, because we're only sort of identifying this in adolescence or adulthood, how can we best set you up for success? Often means having a conversation not in the heat of the moment, right? What are you doing? You missed your exam. Are you like, what the hell is wrong with you? We need to do better at this. I'm going to call you every day. When we're going to have that conversation matters. And if we have the ability to sort of have that prefrontal cortex in place and then to make a plan, not in the heat of the moment, often happens so much. Okay. So does having multiple concussions have any effect on ADHD? It can. Okay. So, but those are two very different processes in the brain. So depending on, you know, what part of the brain was damaged, what part, you know, how many concussions you've had, all those kind of things. There was also some really great questions around, like menopause, perimenopause, pregnancy, hormone changes. When you have a neurological condition, whatever that is, anxiety, clinical depression, and there's other changes that happen in your body, this machine all works together. And so the more awareness that you have of how you respond in specific situations, different times of the month, different stages in your life, becomes really helpful in navigating those symptoms and planning for them. And oftentimes giving yourself some grace in this moment, knowing that, you know, there's nothing wrong with the child or you're not going crazy. I'm much more aware of how the system shifts. Okay. And then it allows us to respond accordingly. Okay. Context is a prerequisite for empathy. I say that all the time. And when I'm trying to get a coach to understand this, or a teacher, or even a parent to understand, it's like, how can we provide the context that they're not bad or manipulative or trying to fuck the whole thing up? If I said to you their insulin was spiking, that's why they fell on the floor. We tend to have a lot more empathy in those situations than, you know, this kid just isn't listening. Okay. So the more you know about the way the brain is functioning or the reasons behind the behavior can sort of help so much. Okay. School refusal, also some really great questions around that. Can you please address school refusal? My daughter 13 is going into grade 10. She has ADHD and social anxiety. She can play high-level sports on a team and has a job, but is terrified to go to school. I'm very nervous because in grade 10, credits count towards graduation. You got it. I don't know how to help her. She feels constantly judged and described each 50-minute period as if it were hours long, and she can't stand being there. Love. Okay. A couple of things matter in this place of adolescence and when ADHD is on board, and there's also the trickiness of adolescence. Okay. It is a shitty time for most everything. Okay, so let's normalize that right out of the gate. There's hormones. There's really a lot of attention to a lot of noise, particularly if you have ADHD in addition to this. And there's social relationships and friends and who do I love and do I love my body? And all of those things are really inundating, okay? Being aware of just how hard that is means that planning a little bit in the quiet moments about how we're going to navigate some of those things when they become even more important. Considering as a parent of a 13-year-old the importance of sleep hygiene, because we tend to sort of let the independence take over a little bit. Not for that, babe. I would say, how do we get a little bit better at monitoring things like house parties, sleepovers, access to alcohol, access to drugs, all of those things? Their brain will not be as able to modulate those things as others, including social relationships. So how do I do a little bit better at navigating that? How do I be conscious of allowing the independence, which they're so desperate for, but also then how do we plan for the classes, the homework, the social things? And I think what it means is just a little bit more, and I know you're maybe rolling your eyes at this, but it's like, who's my ally at the school? Who knows about the diagnosis, particularly as they enter middle school or high school? How can we talk about a routine, a predictable balance of classes? How can we be a little bit more involved and not be, I had another question, how do I not be that mom? Such a good question. If you're saying, I don't want to be that mom, you're already aware of the fact that you're doing everything you can not to be. Because it is that beautiful balance of my kid probably has this little extra challenge in their brain now. I want their independence to grow. And that's why parenting is so fucking hard. Okay. Because when you have a non-neurotypical child, in addition to navigating adolescence and social media and the world, the ease of drugs, sex, and rock and roll, you kind of have to be the brakes a little bit more. Okay. And so managing that, I think seeking some of the resources that I sort of put on here might help a little bit. But know that it's just going to be a little bit of an added challenge, and that's okay. There's a lot of good things that come with that. But how do we just be a little bit more aware in those situations would be something that I would maybe say. I hope that's helpful. What's the effect? Oh yeah. Okay. More about aggression and ADHD. Impulse control is really interesting around so many things, right? So can I fly off the handle a little bit more when I'm in this place of having ADHD? For sure, and I think that just because you have, anger issues doesn't mean you got the ADHD. Again, I think the thing that I really want to hammer home tonight is the idea of getting a thorough assessment, because any one of these situations, inability to focus, being, losing things, losing track of time, responding well to marijuana or cocaine, doesn't mean you got the ADHD. Okay. I think that so much of it is every kid can meet one of the criteria at some point in their life. Okay. A thorough assessment really matters, because this medication is pretty important to get right, if that's the path you choose. And if not, knowing that doing the best you can to create the facilitated environment to give your child in the school or you at work or in your home life the best ability to do the best you possibly can means I need to be very clear about what I'm dealing with and why. Okay. Can you focus on the positive as ADHD? The kids use this as an excuse. Okay, great question. Now, I would also want to be very clear on how I communicate with a kid who gets a diagnosis of ADHD. Okay. And so putting this in context, what it means you're good at and what it means we have to work on is so critically important, because people are scared of any mental health diagnosis, full stop. You got the PTSD? I don't got the PTSD. Oh my God, you got anxiety? I'm not telling anybody I got anxiety. I'm not telling anybody I got depression. I'm not telling anybody I got ADHD. My Asher said this to me the other day. You know what I think, Mom? I think I got ADHD. I said, well, why would you say that? Well, I heard some kid at school said you have ADHD because you can't even sit in your desk. Okay, so what would that mean if you had ADHD? I don't want ADHD. God, then I'll be like fidgeting and moving and getting out of my chair. Like, there's lots of preconceived notions about what this means. And so being able to really clearly have conversations, if a diagnosis is made, about what you're going to be exceptional at and what you might struggle at, means we're going to need to make a plan around this. Just like if you had diabetes, or just like if you had a broken leg, we just need to figure out how we navigate this a little bit better. That's all. And also, as your parent, or as your teacher, as your coach, I'm also going to push through the things that I know you can do well. Okay. So the context is really, really critically important in that process. I hope that helps. Can we list the type of diagnostic test? I think in the resources list, there's some of the more common ones that I put out there in terms of the behavioral checklist that people use. And then most of those are protected in the world of psychology or psychiatry. So you can only get them to make those assessments. The online checklists of whether you have ADHD or not, I mean, scare me a little bit. I mean, it's good to sort of check in with those things, but really don't underestimate the necessity to have a physician or a clinician truly unpack. And if you want to do really great at this job, you will get cognitive assessment, and you'll check sort of all of those things to know. Okay. Should he not be taking medication? No. So what I mean by that, there was a question about my son was diagnosed at 4, should he not be taking medication? Listen, a conversation with your physician and being very knowledgeable about how that affects the babe and the side effects and how they show up in the world is so patient individual. Okay. So I hope there's nothing that I said here today that I'm not for or against medication. I've seen it work beautifully. I've seen it be very problematic. I think the accuracy of the diagnosis is so critically important, and having a really great relationship with your physician or your medication prescriber to navigate changes in your body, changes in symptom presentation is really quite critical. And it can be highly effective because sometimes we're not good enough to navigate the lack of dopamine. Okay, so there's that.
There's a few questions about how can you get the right diagnosis? Family doctors being not helpful and trying to get on them.
Yeah, so great question about wait lists, getting the right diagnosis. I would say that just like most things, I think the CHAD website I put in there is really quite helpful in terms of getting resources. Going to, again, seeking some psychologists I know specialize in ADHD. So you can sort of look at them specifically. Trying different physicians, particularly pediatricians, if you are, working with your babe, who have had some experiences, it can go a really long way. And I guess, as I would say, sort of in many situations, it's about, just really continuing to advocate and seek the resources. And I know it's heartbreaking sometimes because it is a game of, sometimes resources. It's sometimes really difficult to sort of get to the right places. And I mean, it crushes my soul. But having solid, good conversations with educators, having great conversations with family doctors, physicians, getting, the people on board who can sort of advocate with and for you is sometimes some of the best things you can just keep trying to do. So I hope that helps. Yeah. Anything else on your end?
There's a really interesting conversation here. Do you have any recommendations for a narrative conversation that would prompt this initial conversation with your child with the diagnosis?
Yeah, so great. So I don't know if you heard that, but the question is, can you have some narrative when you're having a conversation with a kid who's been diagnosed? I would ask the question. So we got this diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's a lot of words. What does it mean to you? What does it mean when somebody has ADHD? And I would do a lot of asking instead of telling. I would do a lot of, what have you heard about it? What do you know about it? And picking the time to have that conversation is important. I don't know. I mean, if you're new here, here's two of my favorite places, two of my favorite scenarios when we're going to have a hard conversation. Two of my favorite places is in the car or at bedtime, if nobody's really super tired. And I would have a snack if I'm in the car, and I would just chat about it. What does it mean to you? What does it feel like? Why do you think they say that? Do you know anybody else with ADHD? Did you know there's some really cool kids in the world that have ADHD? Do you know Justin Timberlake got the ADHD? I mean, I would just want to know mostly what it means to them and what they think it means to you. And I would ask that question, you know, do you think it changes the way I think about you? Do you think it's going to change the way teachers think about you? Do you think it's going to change what you can do in this world? Does this mean like now universities have a question? Do you think that? Does this mean now that you'll never get a job? Like, I want to know what they're thinking. And sometimes it's like, no, I think it's a superpower. Yeah, me too. How are we going to use this? Okay. And we have to be a team, and we have to be a team on, you know, whatever, if we're taking medication, if we're, you know, making sure that we put our studying aside and we got the white noise on and we're doing our thing just so we can like push ADHD around. I mean, sometimes externalizing it, we do that a lot in anxiety. But how you can sort of use ADHD as an entity that is now like, you know, a friend in the family that kind of sometimes pushes us around. So we got to kick them back is sometimes helpful in sort of navigating that. Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So I don't want to keep you long. I know we started a little bit late, so thank you for staying a little bit later tonight. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think there has been so many questions about this, and I am just so grateful for all of you who showed up tonight. I'm sorry about the little glitch in the beginning, but I think the thing I would say about this diagnosis is that it is important to unpack it. It's not just something that everybody gets. It's not something that can be in a place that will just, you can just overlook it. It's just ADHD, man. It can be super debilitating. And knowing a little bit about it, knowing a little bit about how your body reacts to things or how your child's body reacts to things can make a massive world of difference. Okay. I had a patient recently who has a big trauma history and been working for a very long time, and then really unpacked the symptoms of ADHD, and it made such a significant difference to modulate some medication and to really take a look at then what are the routines that we're doing that would give them the best bet at navigating the day. And it can be life-changing. So you can't address what you don't acknowledge. So much about it is getting it right, figuring out if there's some of these symptoms that sort of push you around a little bit. Why are they there? What is the cause? Then it directs us on how to treat. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. These are one of my favorite evenings, I gotta say. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this little workshop I know is short. I hope it was sweet. Some of the resources I hope you can lean on long after here. Our next workshop is, I'm going to jump into anxiety. I don't even want you to think about this right now, but I'm going to jump into anxiety when we step back in to Stress-tember. Stress-tember is the thing. And I think I wrote it down here somewhere. Oh, look at, oh yeah, here it is. August 14th. So you probably don't want to be thinking about this, but I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and how we prep a little bit together as a community to step back into September this year. So I'm going to jump on August 14th at 6:30 Mountain and talk a little bit about managing anxiety and making this maybe the best year, the most incredible season you can ever step into, so that we don't find ourselves back again next year going, holy shit, why am I so exhausted? Okay. So that is August 14th, 6:30. You can sign up now. I think all of that is open to get your ticket, but I'll remind you again, much closer to the date. Same rules apply. You get 7 days to watch. But again, from the bottom of my heart, I always thank you so much for being here. I hope you tell people about it. I'd love to see you again next time. This workshop series has become such a big part of of my heart. So thank you to this community who just keeps showing up for me.